The wind was sharp that evening, carrying the dry dust of the plains across the lonely desert. The sun had dipped low, casting long, orange shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. In the distance, a small wooden cabin stood alone, its chimney sending a thin curl of smoke into the sky. Inside, a cowboy was finishing his chores. He was a tall man with sun-darkened skin, rough hands, and eyes that had seen many seasons of hardship. He had lived alone for years, and the quiet of the land was both his comfort and his companion. Suddenly, his attention shifted. Far across the plain, he noticed movement. 3 figures were slowly making their way toward his cabin. As they drew closer, he could see them clearly. An elderly woman leaned on a wooden staff, her face lined with years of sorrow and strength. Beside her walked 2 young girls, no older than 10 and 12, holding small bundles of cloth. Their eyes were wide, alert, and full of fear. The cowboy's first thought was caution. Travelers were rare in this harsh land, and strangers often carried trouble. But there was something about their careful steps, the way they looked at the ground as they walked, that told him they were not here to fight. The woman's voice broke the stillness of the desert. "Please, shelter," she said, her English simple but clear. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made the cowboy pause. The girls looked up at him, their expressions timid, almost pleading. The cowboy hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe. The wind picked up, and a swirl of dust rolled across the ground. He felt the emptiness of the land pressing against the small cabin, and the thought of turning them away made him uneasy. After a long pause, he opened the door. The wooden hinges creaked as it swung outward. "Come in," he said finally, his voice low but firm. The woman and her daughters stepped inside carefully. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and the faint scent of old leather. It was small, with a single fireplace, a wooden table, and a few rough chairs. The floorboards creaked under their weight. The girls glanced around with curiosity, their fear slowly giving way to a cautious hope. The woman bowed slightly. "Thank you," she said. She placed her bundles gently on the floor and straightened, adjusting her shawl around her shoulders. She did not speak much, but her eyes told a story of struggle and endurance. The cowboy studied her, noticing the deep lines on her face, the silver streaks in her hair, and the weariness in her movements. He could see that she had traveled far, and that the girls had followed her every step without complaint, though their small hands were scratched and dirty from the rough ground. He motioned for them to sit by the fire. The girls hesitated, then lowered themselves onto the wooden chairs. The fire crackled, sending warm light flickering across their faces. The cowboy moved to the small kitchen corner and set a kettle of water on the stove. He then brought out a loaf of bread and a small piece of cheese, placing it on the table. "Eat," he said simply. The woman nodded and began to break the bread into pieces, handing some to the girls. They ate quietly, their eyes occasionally meeting his in gratitude. The woman tried to speak more, but her English was limited. "Village, gone," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. "Many people, no home." The cowboy nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. He knew that the land had grown harsh, that life was often cruel to those who were weak or alone. Yet, he also understood courage, and it was clear this woman carried a strength that had allowed her and her daughters to survive where others might have given up. As the evening stretched on, the cowboy gave them blankets from his small chest. He showed the girls how to sit close to the fire, and he helped the woman adjust her shawl to keep warm. The wind outside was relentless, rattling the wooden walls and whipping dust against the windows. But inside, the cabin became a small haven, a place of safety and rest. The girls finally relaxed, playing quietly with pieces of string and small sticks they had found on the ground outside. Their laughter was soft and rare, but it filled the small cabin with life. The woman watched her daughters, her hands resting on her knees. She spoke again in broken English. "Thank you, kind man. You help." The cowboy only nodded. Words were not needed. He had seen enough of the world to know that true kindness did not always require a reward. Sometimes it was enough simply to offer shelter, warmth, and safety. As darkness fell completely, the cowboy lit a lantern, setting it on the table so that its soft glow filled the room. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The girls leaned against their mother, sleepy after a long day of walking and fear. The woman's eyes softened as she watched them. She whispered a small prayer. Not for herself, but for her children, to keep them safe, to give them hope, and to help them survive another day. The cowboy settled into his chair by the fire. He looked at the family, realizing how fragile life could be in the desert. Many would have passed by without a second thought, leaving them to the mercy of the cold night and the endless plains. But he had stopped, opened his door, and offered what little he could. In that moment, the harsh world outside seemed slightly softer, less lonely. Hours passed, and the sound of the wind outside became a lullaby. The girls had fallen asleep in their mother's lap, their small breaths steady and calm. The woman's head drooped slightly, her eyes closing as she allowed herself a few minutes of rest. The cowboy remained awake a little longer, keeping watch over them. He thought about the journey that must have brought them here, the long miles of walking, the nights without food or fire, the fear of being turned away from every home. He felt a quiet respect for the woman's courage and the resilience of the young girls. Outside, the moon rose high, casting silver light over the desert. The shadows of the cacti stretched across the sand, like silent guardians. Inside, the small cabin held warmth, safety, and the quiet hum of life. For that night, at least, the family had found a place to rest, and the cowboy had found a reminder of what it meant to care for others, even strangers. When the fire burned low and the lantern flickered, the cowboy finally allowed himself to rest. He leaned back in his chair, listening to the soft sounds of breathing and the distant wind. He knew the journey for the woman and her daughters was far from over. But for now, they were safe. And sometimes, that was enough. As sleep finally claimed him, he thought of the land, the people, and the choices one made when faced with another's need. He had chosen kindness, and in doing so, had created a small moment of peace in a world that often offered none. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, but inside, a small cabin held warmth, hope, and the beginning of a new story. Morning came slowly over the desert. The sun rose like a soft orange flame, spilling light across the endless plains. The wind was gentler now, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dry earth. Inside the small cabin, the elderly Apache woman stirred, careful not to wake her daughters. Their faces were calm in sleep, still touched with the faint weariness of the long journey. She watched them for a moment, her heart heavy with worry and relief at the same time. The night had been safe, but the road ahead was still uncertain. The cowboy was already awake. He had risen before the sun fully touched the land, as was his habit. He carried a bucket of water from the small well outside and poured it into a basin on the cabin's counter. The sound of the water running was quiet, almost ceremonial. He then took a piece of cloth and gently wiped the dust from the table, preparing for the morning meal. When he turned, he saw the woman standing in the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She nodded softly at him, a silent greeting filled with gratitude. He placed bread, cheese, and a small pot of hot tea on the table. The woman helped the girls wash their faces using the water in the basin, carefully drying them on small cloths. They were shy, but obedient. And the cowboy noticed the careful way they followed her instructions. Breakfast was quiet at first, the crackle of the fire filling the room between soft bites of bread and sips of tea. Slowly, words began to flow. The woman's English was limited, but her meaning was clear. "We must go soon," she said, glancing toward the horizon. "Journey, long, no stay." The cowboy nodded. He understood. They could not linger, no matter how safe the cabin had been. After breakfast, the cowboy stepped outside. The morning sun was stronger now, making the sand and rocks shimmer. He gathered firewood and showed the girls how to collect small twigs without breaking them, so they could start a fire quickly wherever they went. The girls were curious, watching every movement, their small hands mimicking his careful motions. The woman stayed close, observing the lesson, quietly smiling at their eagerness. She had taught them to survive, but here, they were learning new ways to face the harsh world. The cowboy also prepared small bundles for the women to take with them: dried meat, bread, and a little cloth to use as a blanket or cover. The woman accepted the gifts with a deep bow, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. She spoke softly, "Kind man, help, we never forget." The girls hugged the cowboy tightly, their small arms full of trust and warmth. He felt a lump in his throat, a strange mix of sadness and pride. They had come to him as strangers, weary and afraid. And now, in a few short days, a connection had grown that felt stronger than any he had known in years. The woman then told him more about her village. The words were halting, but he could understand the story. Their home had been attacked, forcing her and her daughters to flee. Many people had tried to survive, but some did not make it. They had walked for days, sleeping under stars and in the shade of desert rocks. Sometimes, no one would offer them food or shelter. It was a dangerous journey, but the woman's courage never wavered. Her daughters followed her faithfully, trusting in her wisdom and strength. The cowboy listened quietly, understanding the depth of what they had endured. Life in the desert was harsh for anyone, but for a woman traveling alone with two young girls, it was almost unbearable. Yet, despite everything, she carried herself with dignity and quiet determination. He admired her strength and her patience. He realized that every day she had survived was a triumph, and that her daughter's smiles, however small, were a testament to her courage. As the sun climbed higher, they prepared to leave. The cowboy gave the woman directions toward a distant town where they might find safety and more help. He told her to follow the river as it would lead them to water and shelter along the way. The woman listened intently, nodding and memorizing each detail. The girls clung to her side, their small hands gripping the folds of her shawl. They were hesitant to leave the safety of the cabin, but they trusted their mother and, in some small way, the cowboy who had shown them kindness. Before they departed, the woman reached into her bundle and pulled out a small handmade charm. It was braided with thread and tiny beads, simple but carefully made. She handed it to the cowboy, her eyes full of unspoken words. He accepted it, touched by the gesture. "For luck, for safety, for remembering," she said. The girls waved goodbye, their laughter light and fragile, mixing with the soft wind. The cowboy watched them walk across the plain, small figures against the vast landscape. He could see the determination in the woman's steps and the trust in her daughter's movements. For several minutes, he stood there, feeling the emptiness return as the figures disappeared toward the horizon. The desert was quiet again, but it felt different now. The small act of kindness had left a mark, not only on the family, but on him. He realized that sometimes, the smallest gestures, a warm meal, a fire, a safe place to rest, could change a life. He had offered safety, and in return, he had been given trust, respect, and gratitude. The cowboy returned to his cabin, the wind carrying the faint sound of distant voices. He thought about the challenges the woman and her daughters would face ahead. The journey would not be easy, but he believed in their strength. He remembered the way the woman had cared for her daughters, the careful way she guided them, and the courage that had carried them to his door. These were not just strangers who had appeared. They were a lesson in resilience and hope. Days later, he sometimes imagined them following the river, finding towns, and reaching safety. He pictured the girls laughing more freely, their eyes bright and curious, no longer shadowed by fear. He thought about the woman, still strong and determined, walking across the plains with her daughters, teaching them to survive and to hope. He knew life would not always be easy for them, but he also knew that they carried within them a strength that could not be taken away. The charm they had left with him sat on the small shelf above his fireplace. He looked at it often, remembering the gratitude in the woman's eyes and the gentle embrace of the children. It was a small token, but it represented much more, a story of survival, courage, and the simple, powerful act of offering shelter to those in need. Even months later, when the cold winter winds swept across the plains, he would think of that family. The memory brought warmth to the long, lonely nights. He had learned something essential. Kindness could travel farther than any journey, and the smallest acts could echo in ways one could never fully measure. The desert was vast, and life was hard. But in that cabin, on that one cold night, humanity had found a place to rest. And so, the cowboy continued his life, tending to his land, caring for his animals, and living simply. Yet, the memory of the elderly Apache woman and her 2 daughters remained with him, a reminder that even in the harshest places, hope could be found. Even in the coldest winds, a fire could warm the heart. And sometimes, when he looked out across the plains at sunrise, he could imagine them walking toward a brighter day, carrying with them the strength, courage, and love that had brought them to his door. The story of that night stayed with him, a quiet reminder that no one should be left without shelter, no one without hope, and that the kindness of one person could light the way for many. The world was harsh, and journeys were long. But sometimes, the simplest choice to open a door, to offer a fire, to share food, could make all the difference.